Canada looks to trade talks after U.S. Supreme Court tosses Trump's tariffs. In Ottawa, February 21, 2026, began as an ordinary winter morning. The streets were quiet, the snow muted the usual hum of traffic, and government offices prepared for another day of policy briefings and diplomatic calls. Yet, by mid-morning, the corridors of power were filled with a different energy, a mix of relief, calculation, and anticipation. The United States Supreme Court had just issued a ruling that would reverberate through trade offices, financial markets, and corporate boardrooms for months to come. In a landmark decision, the court ruled that former President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs, applied broadly to Canadian goods under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, were unconstitutional. For Canada, this was both a legal vindication and a diplomatic inflection point, one that presented opportunities but also stark challenges. The ruling was celebrated quietly but strategically. Ottawa had long argued that the tariffs imposed by Washington lacked statutory authority. The Supreme Court's decision affirmed that only Congress could authorize the kind of sweeping economic measures the Trump administration had employed. That legal clarity brought immediate relief to Canadian industries that had been under enormous pressure. Steel and aluminum mills, automotive parts manufacturers, forestry operations, and agricultural exporters had all felt the pinch of tariffs that disrupted predictable supply chains. Yet even in celebration, Canadian policymakers understood that the ruling did not automatically undo the damage. Millions in tariffs had already been collected. Businesses faced uncertainty about reimbursement. And within hours, U.S. officials announced alternative measures under the Trade Act of 1974, demonstrating that while one legal avenue had been closed, the broader strategy of exerting economic pressure remained very much alive. To fully grasp the implications of this ruling, one must revisit the months leading up to the court's decision. In 2025, the Canada-U.S. economic relationship, one of the most intertwined in modern global trade, faced unprecedented stress. Goods, people, and capital moved across the border seamlessly for decades. Supply chains spanned provinces and states. Manufacturing, natural resources, and technology sectors relied on predictable policy. Any disruption, however brief, had the potential to ripple through North American and even global markets. Yet in early 2025, the Trump administration imposed tariffs under the guise of national security and economic imbalance, reaching sectors that had never faced direct protectionist measures before. Canadian steel mills saw exports delayed, aluminum prices fluctuated wildly, and automotive manufacturers were forced to recalibrate supply chains to avoid cascading costs. Lumber and forestry operations, particularly in British Columbia, experienced uncertainty as buyers hesitated and contracts were renegotiated or delayed. These measures were more than financial inconveniences. They introduced volatility into a complex system built on trust and legal predictability. In response, Canada pursued a multi-pronged strategy, combining legal challenge with diplomatic engagement. Ottawa's legal team filed suit in U.S. courts, arguing that the president had overstepped constitutional authority. Behind closed doors, trade officials engaged with congressional allies, business groups, and state-level policymakers to build pressure and highlight the economic consequences of unilateral tariffs. It was a strategy grounded not only in law, but in pragmatism, to protect Canadian industries while maintaining a functional long-term relationship with its largest trading partner. The Supreme Court hearing became a focal point for this strategy, and its eventual decision validated Ottawa's position while setting the stage for the next phase: careful, calculated negotiations with the United States. The human dimension of these events cannot be overstated. For Canadian workers, families, and communities dependent on cross-border commerce, every decision coming out of Washington had tangible consequences. Workers in steel mills faced uncertainty about job security. Automotive supply chain employees had to adapt to rapidly shifting production schedules. Forestry workers in remote communities worried about seasonal contracts and exports. Similarly, U.S. businesses experienced rising costs and disrupted supply chains, demonstrating that the interdependence of the two nations meant that unilateral action anywhere along the chain would have repercussions across the continent. The Supreme Court ruling addressed the legality of past actions, but it could not immediately stabilize these lives or resolve operational uncertainty. In Ottawa, the ruling was both vindication and challenge. Canadian leadership quickly moved to translate legal success into diplomatic advantage. Rather than framing the victory as punitive, officials emphasized collaboration, signaling to Washington that Canada remained committed to dialogue and to a rules-based trade system. Ministers prioritized negotiations that would secure practical relief for affected sectors while strengthening mechanisms within the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, to prevent future disruptions. These negotiations involved mapping detailed economic data, demonstrating the mutual benefits of stable trade, and creating a framework that aligned legal principles with practical economic realities. By presenting the case as a partnership opportunity rather than confrontation, Canada sought to rebuild trust while defending national interests. The Supreme Court ruling also sent ripples through financial markets. The Canadian dollar experienced fluctuations, reflecting optimism tempered by ongoing uncertainty. Multinational corporations reassessed risk exposure, adjusting logistics and supply chain strategies to hedge against the possibility of further unilateral measures. Investors monitored developments closely, aware that stability in North American trade policy was essential not only for corporate profits but for broader economic confidence. Canadian financial institutions prepared contingency plans, while trade associations advised members on navigating potential tariff adjustments and reimbursement processes. In the weeks following the ruling, this combination of legal clarity and continued caution defined the business environment, underscoring the delicate balance between victory and vulnerability. Negotiations throughout early 2026 were characterized by meticulous planning and strategic patience. Canadian officials focused on sector-specific relief, recognizing that targeted solutions were more likely to produce measurable outcomes than broad, generalized demands. Dialogue with U.S. federal and state officials, combined with industry consultations, ensured that proposals were both legally sound and practically implementable. Technical economic data was translated into language that resonated with U.S. policymakers, emphasizing that reducing tariffs would not only benefit Canadian industries, but would also lower costs for American consumers, support jobs, and stabilize supply chains on both sides of the border. This approach reflected a humanized understanding of trade policy, recognizing the impact of decisions on workers, families, and communities while maintaining an analytical, evidence-based approach to diplomacy. By mid-2026, incremental progress began to materialize. Negotiations led to phased reductions of specific tariffs, alongside mechanisms to monitor compliance and prevent recurrence. The restoration of predictability in critical sectors gradually bolstered confidence, demonstrating that legal victories could be leveraged into actionable economic and diplomatic gains. The approach highlighted Canada's capacity to navigate complex, interdependent systems, translating judicial affirmation into tangible policy outcomes. The months following the Supreme Court decision showcased the effectiveness of measured, data-driven diplomacy, combined with an understanding of human and economic realities. Underlying these developments was the recognition that trade policy in 2026 could not be governed by law alone. Legal remedies provided authority and clarified constitutional boundaries, but stability required engagement, trust, and cooperation. Canada's approach demonstrated that diplomacy and strategy, grounded in evidence and bolstered by clear communication, could mitigate uncertainty and protect national interests even in an environment of volatility. By emphasizing mutual benefits, presenting compelling economic data, and engaging directly with key stakeholders, Canada shaped a pathway toward sustainable trade relationships, illustrating that legal victories are only the first step in broader strategic management. The Supreme Court decision also highlighted the broader geopolitical implications of North American trade. The ruling reaffirmed the importance of checks and balances within the U.S. political system, signaling that executive overreach could be constrained through judicial mechanisms. For Canada, this provided not only economic relief, but also diplomatic leverage. By framing negotiations around the principles of legality, predictability, and mutual benefit, Ottawa was able to engage U.S. officials in ways that reinforced the importance of long-term stability over short-term unilateral advantage. This approach underscored the interconnection between domestic legal systems, international trade, and diplomatic strategy in shaping real-world outcomes. Throughout 2026, the human impact of these policies remained a guiding consideration. Canadian and U.S. workers continued to feel the effects of previous tariffs, and policymakers recognized that sustainable solutions required attention to livelihoods, operational stability, and the broader economy. By integrating these considerations into negotiation strategy, Canada strengthened both its moral and practical position, ensuring that decisions were informed not only by law and economics, but also by human consequence. This multidimensional approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of international trade as a system influenced by law, policy, markets, and lived experience. As negotiations advanced, Canada achieved several key outcomes. Phased tariff reductions provided relief for critical industries, while new oversight mechanisms reduced the likelihood of future unilateral measures. Dialogue between officials created channels for ongoing cooperation, facilitating coordination and crisis management in case of future disputes. Multinational corporations regained operational stability, investors regained confidence, and supply chains resumed predictable flows. These outcomes underscored the effectiveness of combining legal success with strategic diplomacy, demonstrating that even in a period of uncertainty, thoughtful engagement could produce measurable benefits for both nations. By late 2026, the narrative had shifted from confrontation to collaboration. Canada's careful diplomacy, informed by legal victories and grounded in practical economic analysis, restored predictability and confidence. Sectors previously affected by tariffs adapted to renewed stability, and markets responded positively. The Supreme Court ruling became a reference point not only for the legality of past measures, but for the broader principle that predictable, rule-based engagement was essential in managing complex, interdependent relationships. Canadian leadership's strategic approach exemplified how law, economics, and diplomacy can converge to produce outcomes that protect national interests while fostering cooperation. The lessons of this period are profound and instructive. Legal remedies can correct overreach, but they do not guarantee economic stability or operational predictability. Trust, transparency, and practical engagement are indispensable. Canada's approach illustrated that sustained, data-driven diplomacy, attentive to both human and economic realities, can achieve durable outcomes even in the face of powerful neighbors and volatile policy environments. The combination of legal affirmation and strategic negotiation demonstrated the importance of balancing principle with pragmatism, providing a model for managing interdependent international relationships in the 21st century. In sum, the Supreme Court decision of February 21, 2026, and the subsequent negotiations reflect a nuanced understanding of international trade and diplomacy. Legal victories create opportunities, but they must be translated into actionable policy. Economic stability depends on predictability, cooperation, and clear communication. Canada's approach shows that measured strategy, informed by evidence and guided by human consequence, is the most effective means of protecting national interests and promoting sustainable trade. The months following the ruling provide a roadmap for navigating uncertainty, illustrating that law, diplomacy, and strategic foresight are inseparable in maintaining prosperous, resilient international relationships. As 2026 continues, Canada and the United States face a choice: to prioritize collaboration, shared stability, and mutual benefit, or to allow the past volatility to dictate future interactions. Ottawa has demonstrated that careful, informed diplomacy can translate legal success into practical advantage. By integrating human, economic, and legal dimensions, Canada has set the stage for a resilient, forward-looking partnership. The lessons learned in this period will resonate for years to come, providing guidance not only for policy and trade, but for the broader management of complex, interdependent international systems. The Supreme Court ruling was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Legal validation, when paired with pragmatic strategy, diplomacy, and attention to human consequences, becomes a tool for shaping relationships and securing national interests. In the interconnected world of 2026, law, economics, and policy converge to define outcomes. Canada's measured strategic response demonstrates that even in an era of unpredictability, thoughtful engagement, careful negotiation, and commitment to shared principles can produce stability, resilience, and long-term prosperity. The months following February 21, 2026, serve as a testament to the power of strategic patience. The Supreme Court ruling provided the legal foundation. Canada's diplomacy transformed it into actionable progress. Together, these elements illustrate that successful international engagement requires a delicate balance of law, strategy, and human understanding. As Ottawa continues its dialogue with Washington, businesses and markets adapt, workers plan, and citizens watch, understanding that the decisions of leaders shape their everyday realities. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that trade relationships are living systems, responsive to law, policy, and human agency. Canada's approach exemplifies how careful strategy, grounded in principle and informed by data, can convert uncertainty into opportunity. The Supreme Court ruling of February 21, 2026, is remembered not merely for its legal significance, but for its practical impact, demonstrating that measured, evidence-driven action can restore stability, foster cooperation, and protect national interests in a complex, interdependent world.